A polished mahogany table, 2 glasses of wine, a single red rose in a slim vase. Bernadette Dupont had been smiling for exactly 1 year. 1 year since she had said, "I do," to a soft-spoken sanitation worker named Roy, a widower who still set a place at the table for a wife he swore was in the ground. But on this night, in a candlelit restaurant called the Briar on South Broad Street, the smile died, because a woman, visibly unmistakably pregnant, walked through the door, crossed the dining room without looking at the menu or the maître d', placed both hands on Roy's shoulders, and said, in a voice that cut the music in half, "Booker." The glass slipped from Roy's hand. The red wine bled into the white tablecloth like a wound. And from her purse, the woman pulled a marriage certificate dated 1972, yellowed at the edges, stamped with the seal of Camden County, New Jersey. The names were typed in the kind of typewriter that never makes the same letter twice. Roy Booker. Loretta Marie Booker. This is the story of the woman at that table, the man who lied to her, and the second wife he never told her about. And of the moment, 18 years later, when the truth finally, patiently, sat down across from him in a boardroom on North Broad Street and did not blink. The restaurant was called The Briar. White tablecloths, a piano in the corner, and a hostess who knew Bernadette by name because Bernadette had been saving for 6 months to afford this single night. Her dress was deep burgundy, the color of old wine, and her hair had been pressed flat that morning by her cousin Willa, who worked miracles with a hot comb and a quiet kind of patience. Roy sat across from her in a freshly ironed shirt. His smile was the same quiet, grateful smile he always wore. He had been a gentleman for 2 years before the wedding, a saint Bernadette had come to believe, for every one of the 365 days since. "To my wife," he said, lifting his glass, "the best year of my life." Bernadette opened her mouth to respond, the words already forming, "Roy, you old sweet fool, you—" When the air in the restaurant changed, the pianist faltered on a chord. Bernadette's eyes lifted, almost against her will, to the entrance. A woman stood in the doorway. She was brown-skinned, slightly older than Bernadette, with tired eyes and a coat that had been mended at the cuff. She walked with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had been carrying heavy things for a long time, and the heavy thing, on this night, was the unmistakable swell of a pregnancy at least 7 months along. She did not hesitate. She did not ask for a menu. She walked straight to their table. She leaned down. She placed both hands on Roy's shoulders, the same shoulders Bernadette had kissed awake that very morning, and said, "Booker, Booker, look at me." The glass slipped from Roy's hand. It hit the tablecloth. The wine bled into the linen like a wound that would not clot. And then she reached into her purse. "My name is Loretta Booker," the woman said, and her voice did not waver. "I've been your wife for 15 years. And this," she pressed her hand gently to her belly, "is your 7th child." The certificate she placed on the table between the bread basket and the butter dish was yellowed at the edges. The seal of Camden County, New Jersey, was pressed into the bottom corner. The date was clear. April 14th, 1972. The names were typed in the kind of typewriter that doesn't make the same letter twice. Roy Booker. Loretta Marie Booker. Bernadette stared at the paper, then at Roy, then at Loretta, then at the paper again. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her hands, which had been resting so gracefully on the tablecloth, were now gripping the edge of the seat beneath her, knuckles bone white, fingers aching, breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She remembered the conversation from the courthouse, the soft-spoken man in the cheap suit. He had told her his first wife had died in a house fire in 1982. He had said her name was Margaret. He had looked at the floor the whole time he said it, and his voice had dropped to almost a whisper, and Bernadette had reached across the desk and held his hand, and she had thought, what a lonely man. What a tender, broken man. She had thought, I will be good to him. He had given the dead wife a name. He had buried her in his own mouth, in his own grief, in his own tears. And all the while, the dead wife had a real name, a real face, a real belly round with his 7th child, and was standing 3 feet from Bernadette's chair, breathing the same air, looking Bernadette dead in the eye. "You," Bernadette whispered, and her voice sounded far away like a radio in another room. "You told me she was dead." Loretta's eyes were dry, tired, but not surprised. "Sweetheart," she said quietly, "he told me you were a lie." What Bernadette did not see, what no one in that restaurant saw, was the man who walked out the back door of the Briar, got into his brown pickup truck, and drove north on Broad Street with the marriage certificate still folded in his coat pocket and the taste of unfinished wine still on his tongue. The motel was on Roosevelt Boulevard, the kind with the neon sign that buzzed and the parking lot where men sat in their cars and stared at the steering wheel. Roy paid cash. He gave a false name. He told the man behind the plexiglass that he wanted a room for the night and that he did not want to be disturbed. The door clicked shut behind him. The curtains were the color of old mustard. The bedspread had a cigarette burn in the shape of a question mark. And Roy Booker, 57 years old, soft-spoken sanitation worker turned junior foreman, stood in the middle of the room and did not turn on the light. He sat on the edge of the bed. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the carpet, a brown so dark it was almost black. And he began very quietly to talk to himself. "I was going to tell her." His voice sounded thin in the empty room. It sounded like the voice of a man trying on a coat he knew did not fit. "I was always going to tell her. I needed more time. She would have understood. Loretta, she knows me. She knows who I am." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. The bone ground against the bone. "But Bernadette wouldn't have understood. Bernadette is particular. She would have left. She would have taken everything. I was protecting the family. I was protecting both families. A man provides. A man does what he has to do." He tried again. He could not. And in the silence of a motel room that smelled of cigarettes and old carpet, he realized, with a sickness that started in his chest and dropped into his stomach, that he was not talking about Bernadette. He was talking about Loretta. He was talking about the woman who had borne him 6 children, who had mended the coat at the cuff, who had believed for 15 years that she was the only one. And the lie he had just told himself, that he could keep both houses standing forever, that neither woman would ever have to find out, was the same lie he had told Loretta about Bernadette, and the lie he had told Bernadette about Margaret, and the lie he had told the pastor in Cherry Hill and himself every single morning for 15 years, in the mirror, while he shaved. Roy Booker put his face in his hands. He did not cry. He was not the kind of man who cried, but something inside him, some small private muscle that had held him upright in both houses, gave way, and he sat there on the edge of a motel bed on Roosevelt Boulevard in the dark, and he listened to the neon sign buzz outside, and he understood for the first time that there was no version of the truth in which he was the man he had pretended to be. He was just a man who had been too afraid to choose. And now, the choice had been made for him. 20 blocks south and a lifetime away, Bernadette was standing on the steps of Willa's row home on 17th Street, holding a marriage certificate she had carried all the way from South Broad. Willa opened the door before Bernadette could knock. She took one look at the burgundy dress, at the face beneath it, at the way her cousin was standing as if the sidewalk had personally offended her, and Willa's hand went to her mouth. Not a gasp, a recognition. The kind of recognition that lives in the bones of women who have been alive long enough to know exactly what a ruined evening looks like when it walks in wearing mascara. "Come inside," Willa said. She did not ask what happened. She did not ask if Bernadette was okay. She stepped aside, and the screen door banged shut behind them, and the small row home swallowed the night whole. Willa led her to the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten collards on Easter. The same table where Willa's late husband, Henry, had taught Bernadette to play spades one summer when she was 19 and grieving her own mother. Willa pulled out the chair. Bernadette sat. She did not take off her coat. She did not speak. She placed the marriage certificate from Camden County on the table, face up, folded her hands over it, and stared at it like it was a headstone. Willa stood at the counter with her back to Bernadette for a long time. The kettle was on. The chamomile was in the cabinet. Willa's hands moved through the motions, kettle, mug, tea bag, string, but her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere between the phone on the wall and the morning of the wedding, when she had taken Bernadette aside in the church parking lot and said, "Baby, I love you, but that man has a stillness about him that I do not trust." And Bernadette had laughed and kissed her cheek and said, "That's just Roy, cousin. That's just how he is." Willa set the mug down in front of Bernadette. She sat across from her. She looked at the marriage certificate. She read the date. She read the names. Her jaw tightened. "Drink your tea," Willa said quietly. "And then I am going to make a phone call." She stood. She crossed the kitchen. She lifted the receiver of the rotary phone, the heavy beige kind, the kind that clicked in Word and asked you to be patient. And she dialed a number she had not dialed in 3 years. Bernadette did not drink the tea. Not yet. She sat with her hands folded over the marriage certificate, and she breathed, and she let the room be still, and she chose, with a deliberateness that surprised even her, not to collapse. She had been a girl who fainted at her mother's funeral, who had to be carried out of the hospital the day her father died, who had learned, somewhere in the long, soft years of being loved and coddled and protected, that when the world came apart, you simply lay down inside the pieces and let them cover you. Not tonight. Tonight, Bernadette DuPont Booker sat at her cousin's kitchen table in a burgundy dress with wine still drying on the hem, and she did not lie down. She sat up. She set her shoulders. She looked at Willa across the room, holding the phone to her ear, and she waited. "Tell him everything," Bernadette said. Her voice was level. It did not shake. "Tell Curtis Bell I want to know who this man is. Every piece of paper he has ever shown me, every word he has ever said in my house. I want to know what is real and what is not." And Willa paused, the receiver against her shoulder. "Do not let him sleep tonight." Willa nodded. She turned back to the phone. Curtis Bell's line rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" a man's voice said, half asleep. "Curtis," Willa said, "put on a pot of coffee. Bernadette needs you." What Curtis Bell did in the 14 days that followed was not magic. It was not genius. It was the slow, patient, blue-collar work of a man who had spent 20 years reading other people's paper trails, and who understood, in the way that only men who have been poor and invisible can understand, that a lie always leaves a receipt. The shop was called Hartwell & Sons, and it had been on the same corner since 1953. A bell above the door rang when Curtis walked in. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and a cup of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. Her name was Mrs. Hartwell. Curtis had known her for 15 years. "I'm looking for an order," Curtis said, and he placed the funeral program on the counter in loving memory of Margaret Booker, 1949-1982. Face up, the way a man lays down a card he is not afraid to be seen playing. Black and white, 12 programs, this layout, paid in cash. Mrs. Hartwell put on her glasses. She turned the program over. She looked at the typeface. She looked at the bleed marks along the edge where the cheap ink had not quite dried. 1982, she said. "You understand, I have done thousands of these." "I do," Curtis said. "But this one was paid in cash. And the man who ordered it, quiet, polite, probably wearing a hat he didn't need, he came in alone, and he stayed at the counter a long time, looking at the photograph like he was memorizing it." Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the cash ledger from 1982, the big leather one, the one with the brass corners, the one she kept under the register for tax purposes, and she began to turn pages. "This one," she said finally. She tapped a line. "March 12th, 1982. Cash, $40. No name, just a symbol, a small B in the margin. I remember him because he was the only person that month who didn't argue about the price." Curtis wrote it down. The date, the amount, the B. He looked up at Mrs. Hartwell. His face did not change, but his hand, the one holding the pen, had gone very still. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell." "You be careful with whatever you're looking for, Curtis." I will." The Camden County Clerk's office was on the second floor of a brick building that smelled like floor wax and old paper. Curtis took the number. He waited. When his turn came, he walked to the counter and placed a $5 bill beside the form. "Booker," he said. "Roy Booker. Married in this county, 1972. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes and a perm that was losing the war with the humidity, typed the name into a machine the size of a small refrigerator. The machine whirred. It clicked. It produced a small white card. "April 14th, 1972, she said. "Roy T. Booker to Loretta Marie Ellison, officiated by Reverend Gideon Moss. Witnesses: Hattie Booker, James Ellison." Curtis looked at the card. The ink was real. The seal was raised. The date was not a forgery. It was the original. He folded the card. He placed it in his pocket. He walked out of the building into the bright April sun, and he stood on the steps for a long time. And he thought about a soft-spoken sanitation worker who had stood in this same room 23 years ago and sworn an oath he had no intention of keeping. The money. And the money. That was the part that made Bernadette go quiet for 3 days. Curtis had a friend in the records room of Liberty Bell Federal, a man who owed him a favor since a bounced check in 1981. And for the price of a six-pack of Schaefer, the friend pulled a 6-year printout of deposits to an account under the name L. Booker. Every other Friday, without fail, a direct deposit from Aubrey Construction, the black-owned firm in North Philadelphia, had landed in that account. Sometimes $480, sometimes $612. Once, in 1984, a single deposit of $1,200 with the memo line, "Back Pay, JB." The pay stubs Roy had shown Bernadette listed a different account number, the one that funded her household. 2 accounts, 2 pay stubs, 2 direct deposit authorizations. One man splitting his own salary down the middle like a man dividing a loaf of bread he had stolen from both houses. Curtis closed the envelope. He drove back to Philadelphia. He went straight to Willis Kitchen on 17th Street, where Bernadette was waiting. And he laid the printout on the table beside the funeral program and the marriage certificate and the chamomile that had gone cold. And Bernadette, who had not slept in 3 days, looked at the paper trail of her own betrayal, laid out on her cousin's kitchen table like a body on a slab. And she did not cry. She asked very quietly for a pen. The meeting happened on a Thursday, in the back room of a diner in Camden, on a vinyl booth with a tear in the seat. Loretta came alone. She was 9 months pregnant. Her coat was the same mended one. Her hands rested on the table, palms down, the way women rest them when they are trying very hard not to break something. For the first 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other. 2 women, 2 kitchens, 1 man. The hardest part, the part Bernadette would later say almost killed her, was not the discovery. It was the geometry of it. She had to sit across from Loretta and understand the shape of a life she had never been invited into. There was Roy on Sunday mornings, kissing Bernadette's cheek in the pew at Zion Baptist. There was Roy on the same Sunday afternoon, crossing the George Washington Bridge into Jersey with a bag of groceries in the back seat and a lie on his lips. There was Roy on Wednesday nights, teaching Bernadette how to make smothered pork chops. There was Roy on Thursday afternoons, watching Loretta's youngest daughter learn to ride a bike in the driveway on Lee Avenue. 2 kitchens, 2 daughters calling him Daddy, 1 man at the center of it all, splitting himself down the middle like a tree struck by lightning, standing upright in both places, somehow still breathing. Loretta was no villain. Bernadette understood that within the first 10 minutes. She was a former nursing aide from Camden who had married Roy when she was 22, who had borne him 6 children in 11 years, and who had never once been told there was a Bernadette. She had believed truly that she was the only wife. She had mourned the Margaret identity because Roy had told her that his mother had asked him to use a different name at work, an old family superstition, he said, to keep the cousins in the South from asking for money. It was a story so flimsy a child could have poked a hole in it. But Loretta had been busy, with 6 children, with a husband who only came home on certain nights, with a roof that leaked in 2 places, and a check that always cleared but never quite stretched to the end of the month. Bernadette reached across the table. She did not touch Loretta's hand. She placed a small manila folder between them. "Open it," she said. Loretta opened it. She read for a long time. When she looked up, her face had not changed, but her eyes had. They were the eyes of a woman who had just discovered that the man she had loved for 15 years had been a stranger the whole time. "He told me you were a one-time thing," Loretta said. "He said you were a woman he had to help once, that the wedding was a paperwork thing, for a loan. He said—" "He lied," Bernadette said. "He lied to both of us. And I am sorry, Loretta. I am sorry he did this to you too." The two women sat in the diner for another hour. They did not hug. They did not cry. They made a plan, a small, quiet, dangerous plan. And when Bernadette left the diner, her hands were no longer white. They were steady. They were ready. The betrayal did not end Bernadette. It forged her. She filed for an annulment within the month, took the job at the brokerage downtown, the one she had been too shy to apply for while Roy was alive in her life. By 1995, she was a senior advisor. By 2002, her own desk on the 14th floor, overlooking City Hall. By 2005, she had bought the small house on 17th Street from Willa's widower, renovated it top to bottom. The plastic flowers in the window were replaced with real ones. The radiator still clanked, but the heat worked now. Everything worked now. And Loretta? Loretta's story did not end the way Roy's had promised. The second bank account froze in 2003 when auditors flagged it for household inconsistency. The groceries thinned. The roof got worse. By 2005, she was working doubles at a hospital laundry in Trenton, back aching, hands red from soap, raising 7 children the way she had always raised them. Roy had drifted further away. By 2004, he was showing up only on holidays, and even then, only when he could manage it. The marriage, in Loretta's words, had just sort of evaporated, like he'd been a fever I finally broke. And Roy, Aubrey Construction, the black-owned firm whose paychecks had funded both households, had begun an internal review in 2002 after a routine audit caught a discrepancy in pension contributions. Mr. Aubrey, the founder's grandson, had been looking for embezzlement. What he found was worse. By 2005, the file on Roy Booker was 3 inches thick. Forged documents, a duplicate W-2, pension contributions rooted to a household that, on paper, did not exist. And the soft-spoken sanitation worker turned junior foreman, now 57, thinning hair, slight paunch, back aching when it rained, was about to be called into a boardroom to answer for all of it. The room was on the 9th floor of the Aubrey Construction building on North Broad. A long mahogany table, framed photographs of every project the company had ever built, and a window that looked out over the place where Bernadette had once toasted her future. Roy Booker sat on one side of the table. His hands were folded. He had worn his best tie, the one Loretta had given him for Father's Day in 1996, back when Father's Day still meant something in that house. On the other side sat Mr. Aubrey, a thin man with reading glasses and a face like a closed ledger. Beside him was the company's general counsel, and at the far end of the table, in a chair that had been deliberately left empty, was a place card that read, "Senior Advisor, Aubrey Family Office." Mr. Aubrey cleared his throat. "Mr. Booker, we are here to discuss the disposition of your employment, your pension, and a number of documents my office has collected over the past 3 years." Roy nodded. He had not slept the night before. He had not slept most nights since 2002, when the first letter from the company's outside auditor had arrived in a plain manila envelope. "Before we begin," Mr. Aubrey continued, "I want to introduce you to someone." The side door opened. A woman walked in. She was in her late 50s. Her hair was silver at the temples. She wore a charcoal suit and a single string of pearls. She carried no purse. She carried no folder. She carried instead a stillness so complete that the air in the room seemed to bend around her. It was Bernadette. She did not look at Roy. Not yet. She placed a single manila folder on the table in front of Mr. Aubrey, and she sat down in the empty chair. She folded her hands. The knuckles were steady. "Mr. Booker," she said, and her voice did not waver. "Do you remember the name Margaret?" Roy's face went white, not pale, white, the color of the death certificate that had never been real. He started. "Do not," Bernadette said. "Say my name. You lost the right to that 18 years ago." She opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of the forged death certificate, the Cherry Hill funeral program, the bank statements from Trenton, the 1972 marriage license from Camden County, and a single piece of paper at the top of the stack, a sworn affidavit from Pastor Gideon Moss, dated October 2004, confessing to his role in the scheme and naming Roy Booker as its architect. Loretta Booker, Bernadette said, is sitting in the waiting room on the 4th floor. She has been informed of the full scope of what you did. She has chosen to be here. Roy's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hands, folded so neatly a moment ago, had begun to tremble. The knuckles, always the knuckles, had gone white again. I have been retained, Bernadette continued, as a senior advisor to the Aubrey family office. My role, in part, is to ensure that the pension fund is administered with the integrity its original contributors intended. Your name, Mr. Booker, is not on that list. It never was. Mr. Aubrey slid a single page across the table. A termination letter. In small type at the bottom, a referral to the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. You have 30 days, Mr. Aubrey said. After that, this file becomes public record. Roy looked at Bernadette, and for the first time in 18 years, he saw the woman he had almost destroyed. Not broken, not bent, not begging, whole, sharp, untouchable. He opened his mouth, began to say, I was going to tell you. I was always going to. Save it, Bernadette said. You had 18 years to tell me. You chose the second wife. You chose the second bank account. You chose the second life. And now, Mr. Booker, you will live with the consequences of every single one of those choices. She stood. She did not look back. The door closed behind her with the soft, final sound of a chapter that had finally, at last, been finished. The criminal case against Roy Booker was settled in the spring of 2006. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of bigamy, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of pension fraud. He served 14 months in a state facility in Waymart. He never returned to North Philadelphia. The last anyone heard, he was living in a small room above a laundromat in Altoona, working the night shift, sending money he could not afford to a daughter in Trenton who refused to cash the checks. Loretta, after years of quiet endurance, received a portion of the recovered pension funds and a formal apology from the Aubrey Construction Company. She moved her youngest 2 children into a small house in Willingboro, near her oldest daughter. The roof, for the first time in 15 years, did not leak. Her oldest son, the one who had dropped out of high school, went back and got his diploma at 31. He is a corrections officer now. Pastor Gideon Moss surrendered his credentials. The print shop in Germantown was shut down. The 1972 marriage certificate from Camden County was finally, legally, the only one that mattered. And Bernadette? Bernadette never married again. Not because no one asked, because she had built career, home, name, self out of the wreckage, and there were no more pieces of her left to give away. There is an old saying that a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth gets its shoes on. But the truth does get its shoes on, and when it does not knock. It does not call ahead. It walks into the room where the wine is still wet on the tablecloth, and it sits down, and it waits. And it is patient. Far more patient than any man who ever tried to outrun it. If this story moved you, if you have ever sat across a table from someone and felt the room begin to spin, leave a comment below. Tell us about a lie you watched unravel, or a truth you wish someone had told you sooner. Subscribe to Incredible Narratives and turn on the bell, because the next story is already being written. And trust me, you will not see this one coming. Until next time, stay kind, stay sharp, and never let anyone make you small.